Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone is keeping well. So welcome to our second session of Learning Unit 1, which will focus on theme 2 and 3. We are still forming part of our first chapter, which is the Introduction to Operations Management. So firstly, just apologies from my side. I did owe you this recording last week Thursday already, but I was traveling a little bit and I didn't get a chance to properly record the session. Therefore, I'm doing it today. And we're just going to cover a lot of this sort of theme 2 and 3 is focusing on predominantly operations management, the different levels of operation management, the management level, transformation processes, etc. So without further ado, the session's not going to be extremely long. Theme 2 and 3 is relatively short, as it is still forming part of the introduction. When we go more into operations principles, planning principles, design, process design, etc., which is more into your learning unit 2s, 3s, and 4s, that's when you'll see a lot more of the nitty-gritty and the more important bits coming into play. However, very important to take note of this because there is portions of it that will be in your part 1 POE as well as your final POE. By our next session, which is on Thursday, the 8th of August, I will have the PACER, which will be marrying the POE. So we know exactly where each one is sitting in terms of question 1 sits in learning unit 1, forms part of theme 3. So we know where our focus points need to be. But for now, we're just covering our chapters that we need to. I'm pulling out just important bits, trying to give you as much examples as possible. And that's how we're going to basically roll with the rest of the module. Okay. So to begin, just from an operations management perspective, business operations management involves planning, coordinating, overseeing an organization's core processes to optimize resource management. And the below is the management levels that's related to operations management. So when you decide to study something like operations management, the first thing that you want to understand is, would I get a job? When I do get a job, where would I sit? What would be my position? What is my growth strategy? And I think the main purpose is for us to understand exactly where each organization sort of sits and what forms part of that organization. So from an operation perspective, it is just from a transformation level, how do we now transform something from an input into an output? And the management levels that form part of it. And these are just purely examples. The list is obviously a lot more endless, but this is more from a directorship or a senior level of where these positions sit. So from a plant manager perspective, a lot of times when you look at businesses like OEMs, so Fords, Mercedes, VWs, etc., and even in a manufacturing industry, plant managers are very important. Their responsibility is basically to ensure that the operations or the manufacturing of it runs smoothly. Very similarly, factory managers and manufacturing managers have the very similar scope of exactly how they manage the site or the factory or the manufacturing unit itself. Then we have quality managers, which is also from a senior level of authority. It's more like a SHEC manager. So a lot of SHEC is more of a modernized term, but a lot of manufacturing institutions or organizations have SHEC managers, and it's actually a really growing industry. I have had the privilege within my course at Gibbs. I had one of the SHEC managers from Transnet in my group division, and their roles and responsibilities is a lot more than what we think it is. From a safety perspective, quality of the trains, quality of the tracks, quality of um, the resources that go into it. It's actually something that is quite growing, especially with quality being at the forefront. Remember, we are also a country or a unit that has a high level of exports. So in order for us to export to a developing or a growing nation like a UK and a Switzerland, etc., our quality needs to be of that much more value. So check managers, quality managers are very important. Supply chain managers, which I think a lot of people actually aim to be at some point. And when we're speaking supply chain, I mean, this can be from procurement to operations to logistics to every sort of function within the supply chain. But if we're looking at it purely from an operations perspective, it's how do we source something that is um, of good quality from a raw materials perspective? What is our processes from a manufacturing? How do we get it there the quickest possible time to our customers? And this is sort of the responsibility from a supply chain perspective. Then you have IT managers, which surprisingly enough does fall into operations. So within my organization specifically, we have a COO, which is a Chief Operations Officer, um, who is actually a 2IC to an MD or a CEO. And this person's responsibility, they have all of the operational functions reporting into them, from customer services to actual operations, meaning how do you get a parcel from point A to point B, to IT, to business analysts or business intelligence, innovation, project management. Basically, everyone within these categories reports into a COO. So this just generally forms a little bit of part of of the management levels within operations. Okay. Then we have the different levels of operations management. So mind my scribble, but I wanted to keep this as realistic as possible. So just so you are aware of exactly what the levels of operation management is, it is the three that's noted here: strategic, tactical, and operational. I drew this little diagram or this little triangle purely because this is what we use within our organization. And I just wanted to create a little bit of an example. We have customer relationships managers who basically look after a host of customers, and they have a base of customers that they would go visit, retain, grow, protect, that sort of scenario. And we often get them to do an analysis for us based on the levels of operation management that they go and visit. And the three levels is strategic, tactical, as well as operational. And you can understand the reason why it goes from smaller to bigger to the largest is from a strategic perspective. This is basically where we're sitting, where the people who make the decisions sit, your CEOs, that sort of level. Tactical will be a middle level sort of customer interface. Someone like a finance manager or a operations manager or a supply chain manager for that matter. And anyone sitting from an operational manager may be an operations supervisor, maybe a user of your particular service or your good. Or it may be someone sitting in a customer services background. So it's just understanding exactly where the customer sits. Often we try and ask the question of what, how, when, where, and who. And these are the questions that I'm asking. And from a strategic perspective, we need to understand that operations managers have to ask or answer the questions as truthfully as possible. And if they have to look at it from a strategic perspective, we're asking questions like, what are the goods and services that they want to deliver to a customer? What are the different, what is the uniqueness of that specific goods or service that the customer, requires? What are the equipment and labor that's needed for us to, complete the job? And then the how question is, how can we now manufacture this item to provide the service or the product? how much of the product has to be provided by having an input and an output system. Um, how is the system now being measured? When does the production take place? When is the operation taking place? When will the product be delivered? You know, from a where and a who's responsible for it? Who would the organization suppliers be? So we're asking very high level questions when we're looking at it from a strategic perspective. When we go into something like operational and tactical, our questions become a little bit less strategic. And I think from a decision-making process is starting with identifying what the problem is, and then identifying any limitations, identifying any alternatives, or what is your problem statement, and then trying to implement the best alternative. A lot of times, I'm a tactical and operational. These are guys on the ground level that can actually see the problems, the concerns, and the benefits of changing things to a different way. From a strategic level, all they do is they make a decision based on what the tactical and operational perspective is coming in. So the what question is, you need to understand what sort of products need to be provided by a system. You listen to the voice of the customer. You try and have a lot more of a softer approach when you're talking on the tactical and operational than on the strategic level. Then it's how are we going to create the product? How would it be produced? How are we providing it to the customer? Can we decide what quantities are being manufactured? And then when does it take place? How do we achieve our targets? What is the date? Where's the facility? You know, you have to plan on what supplier you're using. So this just takes you in, or paints a little bit of a picture of exactly where we're sitting from the three levels of operations management, and it allows you to understand exactly where you would sit in if you were in that decision-making space. Okay. Okay, then we go on to the three M's. If we can talk about that. So from an operation management perspective, the eight M, sorry, not three M's. Operations management, as we know exactly what it is, managing systems that are utilized to produce goods and services by transforming your inputs, which is your 8 M's, into your required outputs. And your 8 M's is something that I think as you go on, you'll be able to understand exactly where each one sits in. So the M is money, which is finance. This is a finance that's available to produce a particular item, so you need to understand what the budget is. The operations manager can then facilitate the process, understanding what the financial means is behind that process. How can you effectively do it? What is the lead time? How can you reduce the lead time? And how can you try and produce an item in the shortest possible time so that you have value for money at the end of the day? At every step of the way, you want to be able to create a process that will give you a payback or give you cash flow as quick as possible. Manpower is the people. What is the labor that's involved? It's selecting the right or suitable candidates, mentoring them, training them, developing them, and then rewarding them for doing a good job. What is the KPIs that you are setting for that specific labor force in order for them to turn an input into an output? Materials is basically how do we now obtain, store, a good or high quality of material that's required for the manufacturing of your good or rendering your service. How do you now keep it as safe as possible so you don't have any sort of pilferage? Methods. How do we now choose a design process or a effective and efficient system that will allow for us to manufacture that good in the best possible way? And how can we now convert this? The method, sorry, that was the method. On a management perspective, what is the organizational structure within the business? We have organograms. So with the organogram, who is responsible for what. From a management perspective, are we planning? Are we organizing? Are we leading? Are we mentoring? Are we controlling a process? It's to understand who sits where in the organization or in your organogram, and can they take decisions based on your transformation process. Machines. What is the latest innovation and technology that we can use to transform your 8Ms into outputs, with the most minimal wastage as possible? Messages. How do we now communicate better? What is our BCP? So our business continuity plan, if something has to happen. Have we taken risk management into account? Do we know what is our material requirement plan, or MRP? What is our production schedule? We need to understand from a communication perspective that every single department within an organization communicates with each other, so that we understand exactly what the roles and responsibilities are for each one. And then lastly, it's markets. Are we aware of the market that we want to go in, or that different segments that we want to go in? The information that we get from our customers or our customer target market itself, we need to use that as a marketing tool. And how can we use it as a marketing tool to change our 8Ms into outputs? So as I explained, these 8Ms are absolutely simple. Take it into a real life context and understand it, so that you'll be able to use the 8Ms as inputs and then turn them into a required output. Either it's creation of a good, or it's a rendering of a service. But how do we now move from point A to point Z as efficiently as possible? Then I've just included, and this is directly out of your textbook, but because the examples was actually really nice and very self-explanatory, it's how can we then, like for instance, a farm. What is the inputs? Your seeds, your fertilizers, your fields. From an operation perspective, what do we do? Tilling, planting, growing. And what do we get? Maize, tobacco, vegetables. So it's a very simple transformation process, which I'll go through in the next slide. But how do we transform an input into an output? What is the raw material that's required in order for us to get a fully functional, saleable product? Coal mines are very similarly. Miners, extraction, coal. It's as simple as that. Obviously, we have all our different management tools, our 8Ms that fall into it, but it's as simple as a raw material transformed into a sellable item. Brewery, hops, water, grain. What do? You brew it, you prepare it, you mix it, and then you get beer. Airline, aircraft, terminals, passengers. Then your process is booking a ticket, flying, entertainment, and your output is satisfied customers. So the last sort of example then becomes a rendering of a service and not so much an output of a good. So I hope this gives you a little bit more of an inclination of how important the 8Ms are and how we can now transform a good or an input into an output. And I think this gives us a little bit more of an explanation. So what is an input? Okay, so input is, as we said, our 8Ms. They're used to produce your finished goods or render your service of an organization. They go through a transformation process to become an output. There's two different types of inputs. It's a transformed input, which is like people, material, data, money, all of that is changed during the operations process, and a transforming input, which is the actual resources that's needed by the operation, and itself, they don't need to change. The actual transformation process then becomes the process where the value is added to the input to ensure that the output will have higher value. So a lot of your operations functions are coming out of your transformation stage, and then your output is your final product. So this graph is very important for you to remember. A lot of times what happens is, especially from a case study perspective, they would ask you to do a transformation model of a particular industry or a particular case study, and you would need to provide this with any given example. So just to give you a very high level understanding, this is basically your inputs, which is your 8 M's, okay, which goes through a transformation process, and then you get an output, which is your finished goods as well as your service. Then you go all the way back into your feedback loop. So the arrows at the bottom of the diagram, it represents feedback, and it has to take place on a continuous basis to make sure that the transformation process is basically successful. And the feedback can be a customer's feedback in relation to a good or a service that you've rendered or you've produced. And it can be complaints about quality of a product, or it can be a complaint about the service, or unexpected, bad service that doesn't meet the expectations of your customer. The output arrow here blocks to control your output. Basically, it's one way, or reverse feedback. The feedback between the feedback block and the transformation is a two-way feedback. Okay, so you're taking it directly back to your actual transformation process. And that's basically it. I mean, it's as simple and as self-explanatory as it gets. Putting it in, transforming it, taking it out, feedback loop, value will always be added at the top. And your value is added just to basically ensure that at any given stage, you have a if it doesn't add any value, it shouldn't belong there. So transportation, for instance, adds value. So with it being added value, it needs to be produced. It's important that it means that it's a difference between the cost of the input and the price that's being charged from an output perspective. And yeah, this basically covers your transformation process. So always understand the process and the diagram, because you'll use it from an application perspective. And when you do use it from an application perspective, you will understand it completely well by using specific examples when it comes to more goods than services. Okay, then we have some of your functional departments, and these are your departments that add value to your actual operations system. And these form part of your larger organizations. Some of the times the departments are split. Sometimes in smaller organizations, it's combined function with other departments. But many a times in larger organizations, these are some of the departments that is solely on its own, as opposed to having a combined department. So the first one is accounting department, which we also have an accounting department in our organization. They're responsible for financial management, cost and management accounting, and they basically manage the cost of your raw materials, your overheads, whether your customers are paying on time or they're not paying on time. They determine, costing if you have a wastage in your business, your machine downtime, the cost of holding your inventory. So an accounting department can hold a lot of functions, or it can also be split into like innovation, business intelligence, and accounting. So where accounting fundamentally just involves the cost breakdown of various functions. It deals with management accounting as well as payments, whereas you have BIE that then, or business intelligence, which deals with assumptions or scenarios of exactly how you, if you have a downtime on a machine, what is your cost? So by making those assumptions, you're able to have a BCP, or a business continuity plan, just to make sure that you have business continuity at the end. Number two is your purchasing department or your procurement department. So procurement department, their basic task is to ensure that the raw materials, machineries, equipment, etc., is all of the highest quality that an organization can actually purchase. And they just maintain sufficient stock of all of these items at any given time. The procurement or the purchasing department needs to have very solid relationships with suppliers, as well as the operations department. So operation tells them that they are short of X, Y, and Z. Procurement needs to procure this from a supplier, and then you have a feedback loop. So communication needs to be of utmost importance. We need to ensure that the raw materials, the machinery, the equipment is delivered on time so that the production process is continuous. So purchasing and procurement, very important functions within an organization. It also brings processes in a business. So a lot of times, larger corporates deal with purchase order numbers. So if you are a supplier of a larger organization and you need to get paid, you need to do a quotation, you get a purchase order number. Based on the purchase order number, then you get paid. So it's also from a budgetary perspective, it aligns with the business. And there's less fraud within a business because you have a supplier on there because you're a vetted vendor, as opposed to I've got a friend down the road that actually does X, Y, and Z job function, and they can supply their services to me and I'll take them on because that's my friend. So that's not how it would work. So when you do have a fully standing procurement or purchasing department, you're able to have those processes. So you cut out fraud, you cut out costs, and you cut out any sort of uncertainty within the business. Then we have human resources, and you can understand human resources is the place that you don't want to be called into, but it's your personnel department. They're responsible for managing the people that works within a organization, and people who work in this department deal with personal issues of staff members. You need to be a psychiatrist, you need to be a social worker, you need to be a financial accountant. It's somebody that has a very high EQ and can deal with problems of other people and also be sympathetic to problems with other people. So they also do training, they do labor relations, IR matters, health and safety, anything that can basically revolves around a workforce. Human resources is in charge of that. Then we have maintenance department. So there is obviously a lot more departments than what I've mentioned here, and you can go over all of this, but I just picked on the ones that I know is pretty important, or even the one that's treated as an unimportant guess, which is maintenance. Especially from a production and a manufacturing industry, maintenance departments are very, very important, but it's treated as unimportant. So you can understand, take yourself into an OEM like a Toyota, for instance. If they're producing an element of a vehicle and there's a line stoppage, meaning there's a part that's broken down of the machinery, they're producing 100 of these units every 10 minutes. Any sort of downtime costs them money. It costs the business money. They're not able to produce a specific unit, so they cannot sell that specific unit in a given due date. So maintenance is very important and needs to be absolutely ongoing because a lot of money can be lost due to breakdowns. It now means you have to import a product, a special product. It then becomes a hand carry where your logistics fees is in the hundreds of thousands, leaving out the product cost. Then it comes here, it has to be installed. A lot of times you have to bring the people with the product for them to install it. So by having constant maintenance being done on machinery, you'll be able to sort of forego some of these costs or avoid some of these costs. I mean, it's as simple as even having a hoist or a forklift on your property. How can you now make sure that you have enough, or your forklift and your hoist is constantly being serviced so that you don't have a downtime. When you do have a downtime, your bill ends up being a lot higher than just regular maintenance. So that's just to put things into perspective. Okay, then we go to what the difference between a good and a service is. And I think all of you already should know what the difference is between a good and a service. So for a very high level, a good is something that is tangible, whereas a service is something that's intangible, meaning a good you can touch it, and a service, well, you can experience it. And I think a lot of where this sits, like goods is produced, services is provided. Goods you can store, you can't store a service. You can transport a good, you can't transport a service. You have delays with production, you have consumption delays at the same time. You can have a value of a good, but not so much from a service. Your good sometimes is very different to have differentiation in terms of your Potter's forces, whereas here you have uniqueness with the service. I mean, I come from a service industry and we can innovate for every single customer because we are able to do so because we're intangible. Whereas when you have something that's tangible, you have a production line that it makes it very difficult to create a differentiation for that particular product. So as you can see exactly what it is between a good and a service. And some of the examples I'd like to give you, like for instance, cell phone production. For instance, like a Nokia Motorola, they have an operation function, and the billing for that specific can be classed as a service. Even though MTN, Vodacom, and Cell C, they sell the cell phones, but they don't produce the cell phones. They only render the service of the cell phones. But in both cases, both from a Nokia and a Vodacom, for instance, from both of their perspective, they have operations departments that play a very important role. Then we have somebody like Takealot, for instance. They provide a service. They sell books, electronics, anything you can possibly think of online. And here too, the operations is very, very, very important. Something like the banking sector. So banks provide a service such as loans, investments, that sort of thing. Operations management in banks, they focus on streamlining processes, making sure that you regulate, forming part of their compliancing. You also have, enhanced customer services. And then the hospitality industry, like your hotels, offering accommodation, supper services, event services. So here we have operations managers that look for a service. So you'll be able to, I think by highlighting this, whenever you walk into an everyday, so take it down to your everyday lifestyle and exactly where you go, you need to understand what the difference between something that's tangible and intangible. What is a good, what is a service? And then and try and unpack how operations fits within their category, for instance. What would be your assumption when you walk into a place like Pick and Pay to do your grocery shopping? It's a goods service. You physically buying something that is tangible, that is probably of quality, depending what brand you buy. You can transport it. You can do everything that you can possibly do. And then compared to when you go to a little money market and you buy a courier sleeve from there, that is a service because the courier sleeve is now moving from point A to point B, and that is a service. It's not an actual good that you buy. So try and look at what those differences are in your everyday lifestyle. Okay, so we're almost at the end, promise. And it's taking us through the different operation management structures. Okay. And with our different operations management structures, we can talk about something that is decentralized as well as centralized. So with decentralized, if you think about it, it's something where let's say, for instance, an organization has 10 branches. Every single branch has an operations manager. Every single branch makes a different decision on what they want to do. So who their suppliers are, how they move their product, how they produce their product, who do they sell to in terms of their target market. Everything is very decentralized. The local manager is in charge of that system and determines what the needs that is required from that particular branch. So anything from a planning, logistics, procurement, everything is done in this facility. And it's carried out, or the buying function is carried out by that local manager. When we talk on a decentralized or a centralized system, everything is managed from a central point. So if you have 10 branches, you have one head office. The head office then makes that decision. That decision is filtered down to all 10 branches, and everything needs to be fulfilled by what head office has to say. So your schedules, your purchasing, your planning, everything is dictated by HO. As a result, there's one uniform set of systems where operations managers, local managers, they don't have much of an input into what is decided. So within my organization, everything is a centralized system, meaning whatever head office decides or COO decides, we have to carry that strategy forward to all of our branches. When it is carried on, my operations manager has to listen to what the system or the planning is from COO level, and he needs to filter that into our business or into our branch level. When that is filtered down into our branch level, he will then understand, okay, this actually doesn't work for our market. This works for our market. Out of the 10 things, 9 works, 1 doesn't. The one that doesn't work, you now go back to Mr. COO and says it actually doesn't work for us. Can we try a different approach? If he does allow us to do that, then we try and do something that is more feasible, more cost effective for our specific organization or our specific branch. And that goes more into a hybrid approach, meaning a mix between a centralized and decentralized. It is not mentioned here as part of operations management structure, but it does exist. Some businesses that is corporate but not corporate try and follow a little bit more of a hybrid approach, whereas a business that is quite strict and stringent follows a specific centralized function role, and they have to stick to their guns, or else there will be absolute trouble for them. So yeah, this basically concludes our operations management and what is operations management. And I hope it gives you some sort of element of, this is where I want to be. Operations management is where, by studying logistics and operations management, this is where I would like to be, and this is where I see myself going into, with the various functions. How can you then be part of a supply chain within an organization? And from there, we'll be able to understand a little bit more. So in our next session on Thursday, I want to take you through a little bit of a case study at the beginning. And I think the case study was a little bit on setting the scene from a Pick and Pay perspective. And we can sort of unpack that a little bit before we go into our next learning unit. But I think we will have a little bit of time because these recorded sessions will actually help us to buy some time. So I'll try and cover as much theory as possible in our recorded sessions because there is nobody here asking me questions. But in our actual live lectures, I would like it to be as interactive as possible, where I can ask you a question, you can answer me the best way you possibly can, or I can answer myself. But at least I know I'm getting your comments and your inputs in that case. So yeah, that basically takes or concludes our pre-recorded session. And then I look forward to meeting you guys on the 8th of August for our live lecture, where we can go through a little bit more of the fundamentals and use some case studies and some real life examples. But I hope you enjoyed this session because this just sets a little bit of a scene of what operations management. I know it's pretty basic, but it would be basic at the beginning, just so that you can understand just a little bit of what goes into operations management. Okay, thank you so much for your time, and you guys have an awesome evening, and I will meet you on the 8th. Good night.